My sister Cordelia was barely breathing when I found her tied up in that abandoned barn, clutching a blood-stained cloth to her chest like her life depended on it. I'm Wade, and 3 days earlier, Cordelia had vanished without a trace from Billings, Montana, where she worked as a traveling ICU nurse. She never missed our weekly Sunday dinners, never went anywhere without telling me first, especially after we lost our parents 5 years ago in that car accident on Highway 2. Before we dive in, tell us where in the world are you watching from? If you enjoy stories like this, make sure to hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's episode is truly mind-blowing. Let's get started. The morning I found her, my cattle had been acting strange for hours, clustering near the fence line that borders the old Hendricks property. These animals know danger when they smell it, and something had them spooked. I run a 2,000-acre ranch out here, 30 miles from the nearest neighbor, and I've learned to trust my livestock's instincts over the years. When I followed their anxious gazing toward that decrepit barn I'd assumed was empty, I never expected to find my worst nightmare waiting inside. The barn door was slightly ajar, which was wrong because it had been padlocked for months. Fresh tire tracks cut through the dirt, and I could hear something that made my blood run cold. Muffled crying. I pushed through that door expecting anything except what I saw. Cordelia was bound to an old wooden chair in the center of the space, her nurse's scrubs torn and dirty, her face pale but alert. She was alive, conscious, and terrified. But what stopped me in my tracks wasn't just seeing my sister in that condition. It was the way she was holding that white cloth against her chest, pressing it there with both hands like it contained something precious. The cloth was stained with what looked like blood, and my first instinct was that she was seriously injured, maybe dying right in front of me. I started rushing toward her, ready to cut those ropes and get her to a hospital, but then she looked up at me with these wild, desperate eyes. "Wade, don't touch the cloth. Please, you can't move it. Promise me you won't remove it." The panic in her voice was unlike anything I'd ever heard from Cordelia. She's always been the steady one between us, the one who stayed calm during emergencies, who walked into hospital trauma units every day without flinching. But in that moment she sounded absolutely terrified, and it wasn't just fear for her own safety. Standing in that dusty barn, looking at my sister tied up and begging me not to touch a bloody cloth, I realized that whatever had happened to Cordelia wasn't just a random kidnapping. Someone had targeted her specifically, and that cloth she was protecting so desperately held the key to understanding why. The question that would haunt me for the next several hours was simple. What could be so important that my sister would risk her life to protect it? And why was she more afraid of me removing that cloth than she was of whatever had put her in that chair? Let me back up and tell you how we got to that barn, because understanding Cordelia means understanding why her disappearance shook me to my core. My sister isn't the type to vanish without a word. She's methodical, responsible, the kind of person who calls if she's going to be 5 minutes late. Every Sunday at 2 o'clock sharp, she drives out from Billings to have dinner with me at the ranch. We've kept that tradition for 5 years now, ever since Mom and Dad died in that head-on collision during a snowstorm. Cordelia chose traveling nursing after the accident, taking 12-week contracts across Montana, Wyoming, and the Dakotas. She said she needed to keep moving, couldn't handle staying in one place where everything reminded her of what we'd lost. But she always came back to Billings, always made it to Sunday dinner, and always texted me her location when she moved, between assignments. That's just who she is. So when she didn't show up that Sunday and didn't answer her phone, I knew something was catastrophically wrong. I drove straight to Billings General Hospital, where she'd been working the ICU night shift for the past 2 months. The charge nurse, a stern woman named Patricia, told me Cordelia hadn't reported for her Friday night shift and hadn't called in sick. That wasn't just unusual for Cordelia, it was impossible. Her car turned up abandoned on Highway 2, keys still in the ignition, purse on the passenger seat with her wallet and phone intact. The state police opened a missing person case, but with only 2 officers covering 3 counties, resources were stretched thin. They filed the report, took some photos, and promised to keep an eye out. That wasn't enough for me. I spent the next 2 days coordinating search efforts with every rancher, trucker, and volunteer I could find. We covered hundreds of square miles, checking every ditch, every abandoned building, Every place someone might hide a person. I barely slept, catching maybe 3 hours between search parties while trying to keep my 200 head of cattle fed and watered. The ranch work couldn't stop just because my world was falling apart. By Tuesday morning, I was running on coffee and desperation. That's when I noticed my cattle acting strange, all of them pressed against the eastern fence line staring toward the old Hendricks property. The Hendricks family abandoned that ranch 15 years ago when old Pete died and his kids moved to Seattle. The property had been sitting empty ever since, slowly falling apart under Montana weather. My grandfather always taught me to pay attention when livestock gets agitated. Cattle have better instincts than most people give them credit for, and these animals were clearly disturbed by something beyond that fence. I grabbed my binoculars and spotted what looked like fresh tire tracks cutting across the Hendricks property, toward the old barn. Standing on my porch looking through those binoculars at tracks that shouldn't exist on property that had been empty for over a decade, I felt something shift in my chest. After 2 days of searching everywhere except the one place I'd assumed was impossible, I was about to discover that sometimes the most obvious hiding spots are the ones we overlook completely. I followed those tire tracks across the Hendricks property with my heart hammering against my ribs. The barn looked exactly as I remembered it from years ago, weathered gray wood and a sagging roof, except for that slightly open door. Someone had cut the padlock clean off, leaving fresh metal shavings scattered in the dirt. As I got closer, I could hear something that made my blood freeze, quiet sobbing coming from inside. I pushed through that door and found Cordelia exactly as I described, but seeing her in person hit me like a physical blow. Her wrists were raw from rope burns. Her nurse's scrubs were torn at the shoulder and there were dark circles under her eyes that spoke of hours without sleep. But she was alive, conscious. And when she saw me, her face crumpled with relief, before immediately shifting to panic. "Wade, thank God," she whispered. Then her voice turned urgent. "But don't come any closer to me. Don't touch anything. You have to listen to me very carefully." I started moving toward her anyway because every instinct in my body screamed to get her untied and out of there, but she actually recoiled in the chair. "The cloth, Wade. You cannot remove this cloth. Promise me right now you won't try to move it." That's when I really looked at what she was holding. The white fabric pressed against her chest was definitely stained with blood, but something about the way she was holding it seemed wrong. She wasn't pressing it there like someone trying to stop bleeding. She was protecting it like someone guarding something precious. I scanned the barn while keeping my distance like she'd asked. Whoever had brought her here had been living in this space. There was a sleeping bag in the corner, empty food containers, and something that made my stomach drop. Medical supplies scattered across an old workbench. Syringes, medication vials, surgical tape. This wasn't some random kidnapping by a desperate person. Someone with medical knowledge had taken my sister, Cordelia. Who did this to you? Where are they now? Gone since yesterday, I think. But Wade, you have to call Detective Rivera specifically. Not 911, not the state police. Rivera at the Billings Police Department. Tell her you found me and that I have what she's been waiting for. What are you talking about? What does Rivera have to do with anything? Cordelia's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. The person who took me works at the hospital. He found out I've been documenting things I shouldn't have seen. Patients who were supposed to recover but didn't. Medication logs that don't match. What families were told. Wade, people are being killed, and I have proof. I stared at my sister, trying to process what she was telling me. You're saying someone at the hospital is murdering patients? Not just someone, multiple people. And they know I have evidence. If you move this cloth before Rivera gets here, if you try to take me to a hospital right now, we lose everything. Dozens of families will never know what really happened to their loved ones. Standing in that barn, looking at Cordelia protecting evidence with her own body, I realized this was bigger than just a kidnapping. This was a conspiracy that could destroy lives and had already destroyed too many. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to cut Cordelia loose, throw her in my truck, and drive straight to the emergency room. She looked pale, exhausted, and I couldn't shake the image of that blood-stained cloth pressed against her chest. But looking into her eyes, I saw something that stopped me cold. This wasn't just fear or trauma talking. This was my sister, the same person who'd stayed calm when Dad had his heart attack 2 years before the car accident. The same nurse who walked into life and death situations every single day. If Cordelia said we needed to wait, there had to be a reason that went beyond what I could see. I pulled out my phone and called Detective Rivera like she'd asked, even though I'd never heard the name before in my life. Rivera answered on the second ring. And when I told her I'd found Cordelia and that she said Rivera had been waiting for something, there was a long pause before Rivera's voice came back urgent and focused. Don't move her. Don't let anyone else near that location. I'm coming with a full team, and Wade, whatever your sister is protecting, do not let her move it until I get there. That confirmed what I'd suspected. This wasn't random, and Rivera had been expecting this call. While we waited, Cordelia started explaining in fragments what had been happening at Billings General. She'd been working night shifts in the ICU, and over the course of 2 months, she'd noticed patterns that didn't make sense. Patients who should have been recovering were suddenly taking turns for the worse. Families were being pressured to sign do not resuscitate orders for loved ones who'd been stable just hours earlier. I started taking pictures of medication charts, recording conversations when I could. There's a whole system, Wade. Dr. Marcus Thorne and 2 of the night nurses, they're selecting patients based on insurance policies and family situations. They wait until the family is emotionally exhausted. Then they suggest it's time to let go. You're telling me they're murdering people for money? Not just money, control, power. Some of these families have been fighting for weeks to keep their loved ones alive, and Thorne convinces them they're being selfish. Then the patient dies that same night, and he comforts the family about making the right choice. Cordelia's voice broke slightly. I watched him do it to the Hendersons last week. Their dad was responding well to treatment. His vitals were improving. But Thorne told them his quality of life would never be the same. They signed the order that night, and by morning their father was gone. The cloth she was protecting contained a micro SD card with everything she'd documented. Video recordings from her phone, photos of tampered medications, audio of Thorne pressuring families. But Dr. Thorne had gotten suspicious when he caught her taking pictures during a late shift. Instead of confronting her directly, he'd enlisted Marcus Vega, an orderly who'd been helping cover up the evidence, to grab her and find out what she knew. They kept me here for 3 days trying to break me down, trying to get me to give up the evidence. But Wade, this card has proof of at least 40 suspicious deaths in the past 8 months. 40 families who never knew their loved ones were murdered. 20 minutes felt like 20 hours, but finally we heard vehicles approaching. Detective Rivera arrived with forensics specialists and paramedics, and suddenly I understood why Cordelia had been so specific about who to call. Detective Rivera approached Cordelia with the careful precision of someone who understood exactly what was at stake. She had latex gloves on and a small evidence bag ready as she knelt beside my sister's chair. Cordelia, I need you to slowly lift the cloth so we can retrieve what's underneath. The forensics team is recording everything. When Cordelia finally moved that blood-stained fabric away from her chest, I held my breath expecting to see a serious wound. Instead, there was just a small scratch on her collarbone, barely more than a paper cut, and pressed against it was a tiny micro SD card no bigger than my thumbnail. That little piece of plastic had been the center of this entire nightmare. Rivera carefully extracted the card with tweezers and immediately handed it to her forensics specialist. Can you confirm the data is intact? Within minutes, they had the card loaded on a laptop, and what I saw on that screen made my stomach turn. The first file was a video Cordelia had recorded from inside a supply closet, showing Dr. Marcus Thorne drawing medication from a vial into a syringe, then deliberately injecting something different into an IV bag. The timestamp showed it was taken at 2:47 a.m. on a Tuesday 3 weeks ago. That's Mrs. Patterson, Cordelia said quietly. She was recovering from pneumonia. Her daughter had been staying with her for days, and she was getting stronger. Thorne told the family that night that her organs were starting to shut down, and they should consider letting her go peacefully. Mrs. Patterson died 4 hours after he switched that IV bag. The next files were even more damning. Audio recordings of Thorne talking with Nurse Janet Morse about which patients had the best insurance payouts and the least involved families. Photos of medication logs where dosages had been altered after the fact. Screenshots of falsified death certificates listing natural causes when the deaths had been anything but natural. But the most chilling evidence was a video Cordelia had managed to record of Thorne training Marcus Vega on how to approach grieving families. "You wait until they're emotionally exhausted," Thorne was saying on the recording. "Then you frame it as compassion. Tell them they're preventing suffering. Most people want permission to let go of the financial burden even if they won't admit." Rivera's phone rang while we were still reviewing the evidence. She answered it with a tense "Rivera here." Then her expression shifted to satisfaction. "Both suspects are in custody. We got Thorne in his office trying to shred patient files, and Vega was caught attempting to access Cordelia's locker at the hospital." She looked at Cordelia with something close to admiration. "The timing couldn't have been better. While they were focused on keeping you here and trying to break you, they had no idea we were building a case around the evidence you'd already provided. Your kidnapping actually gave us the probable cause we needed for search warrants." I finally understood why Cordelia had been so desperate to protect that cloth. Without this evidence, Dr. Thorne would have continued his operation indefinitely. 40 families would never have known their loved ones were murdered, and dozens more would have become victims. That tiny SD card represented justice for people who couldn't speak for themselves anymore. 6 months later, I sat in a federal courthouse watching Dr. Marcus Thorne receive a life sentence without the possibility of parole. The judge called his crimes a profound violation of the sacred trust between medical professionals and the vulnerable patients in their care. Marcus Vega got 30 years for kidnapping and conspiracy to commit murder. Nurse Janet Morse, who had helped falsify records, received 15 years after cooperating with prosecutors. The numbers still haunt me. 43 patients died unnecessarily over 8 months. 43 families who trusted the hospital to save their loved ones, only to have that trust weaponized against them. The lawsuits against Billings General reached into the tens of millions, forcing complete administrative changes and new oversight protocols that hospitals across the country have since adopted. Cordelia never went back to nursing in the traditional sense. The trauma of those 3 days in the barn, combined with the weight of what she'd witnessed at the hospital, changed her in ways that took months to understand. She started having nightmares, couldn't be in enclosed spaces for very long, and flinched whenever anyone approached her from behind. But instead of letting that trauma defeat her, she transformed it into purpose. She now works as a medical consultant for law enforcement agencies, investigating healthcare fraud and suspicious patient deaths. The FBI created a position specifically for her expertise, and she's helped expose similar operations in hospitals across 5 states. Cordelia found a way to turn her worst experience into protection for people who can't protect themselves. As for me, I learned something about courage that I'll carry for the rest of my life. I've always been the type to charge headfirst into problems, to fix things with immediate action. Finding Cordelia in that barn tested every protective instinct I had. Every fiber of my being wanted to grab her and run, but she needed me to trust her judgment even when I couldn't understand it. Sometimes the bravest thing isn't taking action. Sometimes it's stepping back and trusting someone else's expertise, even when your heart is screaming at you to do the opposite. Cordelia had spent weeks carefully building a case that would bring justice to dozens of families. If I had followed my instincts and rushed her to a hospital that day, Dr. Thorne would still be practicing medicine, and more people would have died. That blood-stained cloth taught me that the most important evidence isn't always visible on the surface. It's what we're willing to protect, even when we don't understand why. Cordelia didn't just save those 43 families from never knowing the truth about their loved ones. She reminded me that heroism comes in many forms, and sometimes the smallest decisions carry the greatest weight. I still run the ranch, still have Sunday dinners with Cordelia when her work allows it. But now I pay attention differently. I listen more carefully when someone asks me to trust them, especially when I don't understand their reasoning. That little SD card proved that courage isn't always dramatic or obvious. Sometimes it's a nurse working late shifts to document evidence or a brother choosing to trust rather than react. The cloth is gone now, entered into evidence and stored in some federal facility. But the lesson it taught me remains. Justice often requires patience, and protecting the truth sometimes means protecting things we can't immediately see or understand.